And nevertheless, that's it. That my people think, and we are grateful that you all do. And that's why here at this conference, I esteem RC as one of the great heroes of the faith today, and the lineup that he's got in here, I wonder why I'm actually here. In fact, I was thinking of the subject they've given me, the existence of God. I wish I could just say, just listen to what the others have said, and that demonstrates it, and we're okay. But it reminds me of the two guys who were sitting for an exam, and at the end of the exam, they were being interviewed for the job, and the man says, I've got a problem. Both of you guys have answered the questions exactly the same way, word for word. There is no difference in your answers. But I'm going to give it to this gentleman rather than to you. And the guy got offended. How come if our answers are identical, you're giving it to him and not to me? He says there was one difference. In one of the questions, his answer was, I don't know the answer to this question. And your answer was, neither do I. So I just feel like saying, so do I, what you've just heard. I remember when I was at graduate school, sent my doctrinal examination question, and we had these tiny little apartments, and you had to get no help, just your Bible next to you, and it was a multiple page thing, and the opening question was, God is perfect, explain. So I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult thing I could think of is define God and give 2 examples. Now, the fascinating thing about that question is there was just this much of space in which to do the explaining. And I was grateful for that, because the longer the answer, the greater the possibility of heresy on something like that. So I answered in one line. He's the only entity in existence, the reason for whose existence is in himself. All other entities or quantities exist by virtue of something else. And in that sense, he alone is perfect. Uncaused, infinite, independent. Being in essence. And so when we talk today about a subject as transcendingly intimidating as that, we've got a tough subject on hand. So I'm going to take it in 3 phases. The first I'm going to talk about is the intense philosophical problems that arise from the denial of God's existence. Number 2, how then do we demonstrate God's existence? And number 3, why is the Christian faith unique in representing this particular notion of God and who he is? So that's a tall order within a few minutes on hand, but we will make our attempt to do so. So put your thinking caps on and race along with me. We'll try and do our best, and hopefully the other messages converge at the same time. Many of you are familiar with these lines of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a poignancy to what he said, and in many ways he also had a candor to what he said. He broke new ground. He did not coin the phrase, God is dead. He popularized it. He was the son of a minister, and both of his grandfathers were in the ministry. But this brilliant man, who was born 1844, died in 1900, did so much in that short span of time, and ironically lived out his own sense of nihilistic thought. When he died, the last 14 years, he spent insane, and in periods of silence would suddenly break into scriptures that he'd learned as a young lad. But listen to how he words it. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? So they shouted and laughed, but the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, maybe? Are we not perpetually falling backwards and forwards and sidewards and in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and he is dead. He remains dead. We've killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Is not this the greatest of deeds, too great for us? Must we not now ourselves have to become God, simply to seem worthy of what we've done? There's never been a greater deed, and whoever shall be born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. It's been related further that on the same day the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Let out and quieted, he said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they're not the tombs and sepulchres of God? God is dead. We have killed him. You know, with all due respect for Nietzsche and regard for him, the thing about him I like is his candor. He is raising the right questions of the implications of a godless universe. Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Is there any up or down left? Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? What he's really saying is, this is so humongous a deed that everything will have to be redefined. Everything. And so the atheist, if you'll pardon the crassness of it, my professor, Dr. Geisler, in my graduate school days used to have a very dry wit, had a dry wit, and he would say things like this: the atheist is better at smelling rotten eggs than laying good ones. He's right. They're able to sort of take this blade and lacerate away. Read Sam Harris's book, you know, The End of Faith. Read his other book, A Letter to a Christian Nation, where he's challenging America to shred this vestige of God talk and God ideas. I'm in the process of writing a response to him, which hopefully will be completed very soon, calling it A Letter to Sam Harris on behalf of a Christian nation. But they do it. They jab away, they stab away. There are 3 or 4 things, actually there are several things, and I don't have the time to go into all of them, but there are several entailments that they have struggles with. The first is this: they have an intense problem then with defining morality. How do you talk up and down? How do you arrive at a moral law? And their standard response is, you know, look at all the evil that is around us. I remember years ago at the University of Nottingham, when I first began, a student stood up and said to me, there's no such being as God because of all the evil that is around in the world. I said, can we talk on that for a few moments? He said, yes. I said, remain standing. I'll talk to you. I said, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to distinguish between good and evil? He struggled for a few moments with that, and I reminded him of the conversation between Frederick Copleston and Bertrand Russell. When Bertrand Russell was pushed to the wall by Copleston, Copleston said to him, Mr. Russell, how do you differentiate between good and bad? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, but wait a minute, you differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? Yes. How do you differentiate between good and bad? Bertrand Russell said, on the basis of feeling. What else? Now, wait a minute. Copleston was a kind man. He really should have turned to Lord Russell and said to him, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors. In other cultures, they eat them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference? How can this brilliant mathematician philosopher make so basic an error? But he admitted it. In a letter to the Observer, he said, I do not know how to deal with this issue of morality. It haunts me. You see, the question of a moral law comes within us. So I said to him, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, you must assume a moral law. He said, all right, I'll grant you that. I said, but when you say there's such a thing as a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. If there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? He looked at me and I quote, he says, what then am I asking you? I said, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to help you. Now, granted, if you're a thinking person, you'll say, Ravi, how do you get from the moral law to the moral lawgiver? Is that not an extrapolational jump? And in the Q&A time, if that question comes, I'll be very happy to deal with it. Right now, my time is very tight. So I've got to go on. The problem of evil, when you raise it, you raise the question of the nature of good. And when you raise the question of the nature of good, you have to start wondering, how do you really arrive at the reality of good and evil when there is no God? Do you know what Richard Dawkins has now come up with? Dawkins has gone so far as to say we have to deny the reality of evil if our argument is going to stay. So he actually denies there is any such thing as evil. I was flying out of a country where I sat next to a woman who rescues women and children from abuse. I won't name the country, but she told me, she was a Dutch lady. I said, were you successful? She said, I saw the worst thing I saw last night. She said, in this area of city called Snake Alley, men come at night, they consume a concoction of snake's blood and hard liquor. It ravages the mind, and then whatever they want, they are given. She said, I rescued an 18-month-old baby girl from the arms of this man who was sexually plundering her, because that's what he wanted under the influence of snake's blood and hard liquor. Mr. Dawkins, is that evil? Can you imagine there walk human beings for whom that is pleasure? Is this the ravaging of just the brain or the ravaging of the soul? Dawkins says, no, we're dancing to our DNA. Is that what he was doing? It's easy to come up and say, God is dead, God doesn't exist. How then do you make any moral pronouncements of any kind? Alan Dershowitz, Harvard. I don't know if there's good, but I have to say there's such a thing as evil. What? Day before yesterday's USA Today. An article advertised on the front page and then in the book section of a recent psychiatric study that is actually saying evil is real. Evil is real. And then they bring all the gurus to try and counter the point. There's no moral law. There's no rational way. And if, just in case you think I'm making this up, listen to the most brilliant, prolific Canadian atheistic philosopher, Kai Nielsen. We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, listen to this qualifier, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason does not decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this actually depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not lead you to morality. This is an atheist saying that. Rationally, you cannot get there. Listen to Bertrand Russell. He says this. He says, I cannot live as though ethical values were simply a matter of personal taste. And he says, I do not know the solution to this. And so to deny the existence of God is to take you out of the realm of moral postulates. Secondly, it takes you out of the realm of meaning. You have no absolute way of positing meaning anymore, what meaning actually means. Listen, for example, to Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, the late Stephen Jay Gould, I should say, the paleontologist, well known in his stridency. Here's what he says. We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. We are here because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but believe me, none exists. These explanations, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. Do you feel exhilarated? We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is simply no other way. That's why the rock musician says, knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind I see is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. No moral law, no meaning, and lastly, of the atheist, amongst many other things, there's no hope. There's really no hope. Do you know how much this world longs for hope? Let me give you an incredible illustration of this. I was in Lebanon a few weeks ago, and my traveling associate, Philip, was with me. He was having breakfast with some Iraqis. And the pastor from Iraq was telling us that a few weeks before that, 3 weeks before we were conversing, he was driving along the streets of Baghdad. He's a young man with a young family. He said, suddenly a huge booming sound. My car actually was lifted off the road, and I looked around, and the buildings around me were collapsing. And I literally saw one man's limbs flying off his body as he fell onto the sidewalk there. He said, I had to stop. My head felt cold, and as I touched my face, blood was pouring out of my ears from the concussion. He said, I was in a state of shock and taken to the hospital. He said, Brother Ravi, we live with this every day. When I say goodbye to my children in the morning, I never even know I'm going to see them. And so Hassan was chatting. I leaned forward. I said, Hassan, is it good or bad what's happened in Iraq? What we did? I said, I want to hear from your mouth. Tell me. He said, before America came to our help, we were living with a lot of pain, everyday pain. After America's come to help us, we still live with a lot of pain, but now we have pain with some hope. You don't have to agree with him. I don't have to agree with him. I'm not saying that. I'm not making a political statement here. I'm just telling you this. A man who just had his car and life nearly blown up is looking you in the eye and saying, we could not live without hope. Today's story in the Houston Chronicle, an 11-year-old boy who for 1 year has fought for custody of his baby sister, who was described as nothing more than fetus Holloway, stillborn. 30-some weeks or something like that, pregnant, I forget how it was. Stillborn. The mother is in drug rehab. Father cannot be found. This 11-year-old boy goes to the medical authorities and asks for the body of his sister. For 1 year, he fought it. And he got the little body back. He takes 3 of his cousins and conducts the funeral with some stuffed animals and some flowers and a pink blanket. He lost his dad when he was 1 year old, he says. He says, now my sister Rachel, who had no name in the morgue, he's given her the name Rachel. He says, now my sister Rachel and my daddy are in heaven together. The Houston Chronicle writer says, very rarely in life can you use the word greatness, but I looked into the eyes of this 11-year-old boy and I was looking at greatness. Hope. The atheist has got nothing to give to you. You die, it's nothing more than a physical compilation of atoms that had no prevision of what it was forming. And so you denounce God, you end up with no moral law, no meaning, and no hope. All right, what does that do about the existence of God then? How do we try to even demonstrate that? Let me get into some little bit of an argumentation here, and you may not be able to write as fast as we speak this, but thankfully you're able to hear that again and at least make notes on it. I don't use PowerPoint. I'm technologically challenged. I always say, he gives me the power and I try to make the point. And if you can get it that way, it's okay. Last week I was lecturing somewhere and I asked them for an overhead projector and they said, what's that? I said, the inventor of the overhead projector has just been terribly insulted by you. He spent all his life doing that and you don't know what it is. There are many ways to argue this. R.C. is just a master of this with his knowledge of Aquinas and Augustine and many of them who've given such powerful, especially Aquinas, who was the master theologian and thinker of his time with his 5 ways and so on. Basically, no matter what kinds of arguments you've heard, they filter down to 2 or 3 very strong forms. Some like to call them proofs, some like to call them evidences, some like to call them arguments, some like to call them the coherence factor. I like the way Dallas Willard has summarized it, taken the best of these, and actually just come with 3 stages of argument. Here's the first stage. Stage number 1. It is the nature and existence of the physical reality that we see. Now listen to this statement very carefully. However concrete physical reality is sectioned up, the result will be a state of affairs which owes its being to something other than itself. No matter how you section down physical concrete reality, no matter how small you break it down, no matter what you do with it, you end up with the state of affairs that physical quantity owes its being to something else and is not self-existent. It is not self-explanatory. If I were to bring an apple to you and show you that apple, you can cut that apple down, you can grate it, you can slice it, you can take it under all kinds of telescopic or microscopic study or whatever it is, you'll end up with the same reality that it doesn't explain its own existence. Now, that every physical state, listen now, no matter how inclusive, has a necessary condition in some specific type of state which precedes it in time and is fully existent prior to the emergence of the state which it conditions. What does that mean? You take this apple. You know the apple didn't bring itself into being. Whatever was needed to bring that apple into being, a full-grown tree in your backyard or whatever, had to pre-exist, and all the conditions needed for that tree to exist prior to the bringing forth of this apple had to be completed in time in order that this apple through the blossom may then ultimately grow as a fruit on that tree. The apple doesn't explain its own existence. It is dependent on something which also had to be completed in time in order to produce the entity you are discussing. But the reality is, neither does the tree explain its own existence. You go back across a series of physical causes, and there is not one example in the physical universe of a physical quantity that explains its own existence. And to add to it, if you start back from the apple I'm illustrating and go back all the way to the series of causes, You cannot have an infinite series of causes in time, because if you had to have the infinite series of causes, it would never have arrived at this moment. If you have a domino called X, and you've got to have an infinite number of dominoes falling before X falls, you will never get to X, because you will need an infinite number of dominoes to fall. So what is it we have posited by this point? No physical quantity explains its own existence, and no amount of time can consume an infinite series of events to bring you to the present. Which means all of these somewhere have to be explained by one self-existent cause, which is not physical. Because a physical quantity, as we know it in reality, it cannot explain its own existence. C.S. Lewis puts it this way: an egg which came from no bird is no more natural than a bird which had existed from eternity. An egg which came from no bird is no more natural than a bird which had existed from eternity. So stage one is that we do not have one instance of a physical quantity that completely explains its own existence. Stage number two, it is the argument to design, not from design. Try and understand the difference. Very important difference. It is the argument to design and not argument from design. What is an argument from design? If you take the vastness of the universe, for example, think about it. There are flames of the surface of the sun, which are 40 times higher than the entire dimension of this earth. Massive, massive flames. I remember teaming up with an astrophysicist in South Africa, and he was showing a slide at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where we were lecturing together. And he said, if you look at that picture there, David Bloch said, there's 100 billion stars on that screen. He said, if you started counting them now and counted 1 star per second, you'd have to be here for 2,500 years. Just the vastness of it. I remember doing a course in quantum theory under the famed quantum physicist John Polkinghorne, president of Queen's College, Cambridge, who was a latecomer to Christ. Polkinghorne once talked about all of the contingencies in the early picoseconds of the universe. You know what a picosecond is? A picosecond is that amount of time which elapses when it takes something traveling at the speed of light to cross the strand of a single breath of hair. That's a picosecond, which means almost abstract. Think about it. In the early picoseconds of the universe, he talked about the early contingencies. Here's what Polkinghorne said to us. He said, take the expansion-contraction ratio. It had to be so exact, margin of error so small. He said it would be like taking aim at a 1 square inch object at the other end of the known universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting it bullseye. That's just one contingency. And then in typical British understatement, he turned to us and said, gentlemen, there's no free lunch. Somebody had to pay. That's an argument from design. What do we mean by an argument to design? The argument to design, and I want you to understand me very carefully now, evolution is not an explanation for ultimate origins. It is not an explanation for ultimate origins. Evolution doesn't explain the Big Bang. Did the Big Bang evolve? What caused the Big Bang? If you were in your room sleeping at 3 o'clock in the morning and you heard a little bang, you'd want to know what the little bang was. We just think we've talked about the Big Bang and we've solved it. The Big Bang didn't evolve. I remember talking to a group of scientists at University of Florida. They're having dinner together. I'm not very comfortable with scientists. If you're one of them, forgive me. I know philosophers can be boring too. I remember Lee Strobel telling me he blames me for his son going into philosophy. And he looked at his son one day and he said, "Do you know what the difference is between a philosopher and a large pizza?" And his son said, "Is this a trick question?" He said, "Do you know the difference, son?" He said, "What?" He said, "Do you know the difference between a philosopher and a large pizza?" He said, "Tell me, Dad." And Lee said to him, "A large pizza can feed a family of 4. So we're having dinner, physicists and myself, waiting for the dinner to be over so I could leave and sound normal again. And I said to them, "All right, you boys are naturalists. You take exception to the metaphysicians. You're naturalists." I said, "What is the Big Bang?" He said, "Well, it's where everything was reduced to a singularity." I said, "And?" "Don't you always say it's where the laws of physics actually break down?" "That's true." I said, "So even your starting point is non-natural." If the laws of physics break down at the singularity, then your starting point is also not natural. Do you know what one of them said to me? "We retain a selective sovereignty over the issues we like to extrapolate from." Now, I'm not knocking science. I'm just telling you this. Not all order has evolved. The argument to design, there is a configuration and a coalescing of intelligent entities and quantities that predispose the possibility of the resultant entity that came into being. I had dinner with Francis Collins, the co-mapper of the human DNA. He said to me, when I finished my studies on it, he said very simply, "I have to say this to you. I felt I was looking at the book of life, 3.1 billion bits of information." When I finished speaking at Johns Hopkins, prior to me was Francis Collins. My wife was with me and we were listening to his talk. It's one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen. He showed us on the screen a beautiful, geometrically perfect stained glass picture from York Minster Cathedral in England. And he put it up on the screen. You're wowed. Then he divides the screen, and on the right he shows a slide of the design of the human DNA. There was an audible sound in the audience like, "Wow." And most of them were skeptics. When I see the heavens and the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, what is there in man that you should keep him in mind? For you have set your glory above the heavens. No wonder in December 68, when the boys were going around the dark side of the moon, and they vouchsafed a glimpse of this earth given to no human eye, and they saw earth rising over the horizon of the moon, draped in a beauteous mixture of black, blue, and white, garlanded by the glistening light of the sun against the black void of space. There's only one line that came to their minds as the world waited. No, it wasn't Stephen Jay Gould. It wasn't Russell. It wasn't Nietzsche. It was the opening lines of the Bible. In the beginning, God. Stage 1, no physical quantity explains its own existence. Stage 2, there's an argument to design. No matter how you slice it down, there's a coalescing of intelligent components that made it possible to even bring this type of thing into existence. You know, that's why people like Hume and Einstein and all were what you'd call second-grade theists. Sort of talked about a mind, but didn't know where to park that mind. They didn't know where to park it because they didn't want the person of God brought into the scene. That's stage 2. Stage 3, the course of human events, historical, social, and individual. The course of human events, historical, social, and individual, within the context of a demonstrated extranaturalism, stage 1, and of a quite plausible cosmic intellectualism, stage 2. Let me repeat that statement. The course of human events, and these are not my words, they are Dallas Willard's words. The course of human events, Historical, social, and individual, within the context of a demonstrated extranaturalism, stage 1, and of a quite plausible cosmic intellectualism, stage 2. Now, I could take you to many places from here with that. If you look at the course of human events, you end up with this fact: how do you explain many things in history? You remember the famous parable by Anthony Flew and Wisdom? You've got to hear this carefully because John Frame has made a tremendous response to it. Listen carefully, please. Once upon a time, 2 explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds. One explorer says, "Some gardener must tend this plot." So they pitched their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen, but perhaps he's an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence, they electrified, they patrol it with bloodhounds. But no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received a shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry, yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks. A gardener has no scent and makes no sound. A gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. At last the skeptic despairs. "Ah, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from one, no gardener at all?" Here's the question. How does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even no gardener at all? John Frame, in his Apologetics to the Glory of God, begins with this. Once upon a time, 2 explorers come upon a clearing in the jungle. A man was there, pulling weeds, applying fertilizer, trimming branches. The man turned to the explorers and introduced himself as the royal gardener. One explorer shook his hand and exchanged pleasantries. The other ignored the gardener and turned away. "There can be no gardener in this part of the jungle," he said. "This must be some trick. Someone is trying to discredit our previous findings." They pitch camp every day. The gardener arrives, tends the plot. Soon the plot is bursting with perfectly arranged blooms. He's only doing it because we are here to fool us into thinking this is a royal garden. But one day the gardener takes them to a royal palace, introduces the explorers to a score of officials who verify the gardener's status. Then the skeptic tries a last resort. Our senses are deceiving us. There is no gardener, no blooms, no palace, no officials. It's all a hoax. Finally, the believer despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? Just how does this mirage, as you call it, differ from a real gardener? Do you follow the point? The gardener did come, and the gardener was seen. Let me give to you 3 or 4 reasons why this gardener reveals God so perfectly. First, his description of the human condition. He points to your heart and my heart so accurately that when you finish reading Jesus' description of you, you know he knows you extremely well. And so the woman at the well who tries all these theological smoke screens, finally, he says to her, "These are not your real questions, are they? You've had 5 broken relationships. The man you're living with is not your husband. Isn't that true?" He did that so gently that she runs back to her village and says to the people, "Come back and see the one who told me everything about myself. Truly, Messiah has come." You take the readings of Muhammad, Buddha, Krishna, if he ever lived, and see their description of the human condition. It doesn't conform to reality. But you take the description of Jesus, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So whether you're the head of Enron or whether you're running Playboy magazine, the heart is desperately wicked above all things. And that's precisely the point of the article 2 days ago in USA Today. The psychiatrist says, no matter who we are, when the chips are down and the compulsion is there, every one of us turns out to be a rotter. That's what the Bible said. That's what the Bible says. You know, I remember walking through Auschwitz years ago and seeing the horrors of what was done. My wife is really quite extremely well read on world wars and especially Second World War, and almost everything she ever reads out to me or quotes to me or talks about tells you what shocked humanity was that they were ordinary people. Ordinary people. Ordinary human beings. Eichmann, Goering, Himmler. When they sat being tried, one of them basically said, the first time I said yes, I didn't like it, but then I got used to it, to the slaughter of millions. Go to Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau and see the human heart. And you know, we gotta get away from all of this. People like Sam Harris and all who brandish their penmanship like a sword to lacerate Christians and all the wars we've caused, has he ever counted the millions that atheism has killed? And the difference in atheism, it can logically emerge. In a transcendent Judeo-Christian worldview, it would have to be in violation of what they believe. The kind of stuff that's going on. He doesn't care that 10 million female babies have been eradicated in India only because they were female. Is this all right? Or is this the human heart displayed in such heartbreaking ways? He describes, and Hobart Maurer went to his grave a skeptic. He taught at Johns Hopkins, taught at Harvard, committed suicide at the age of 75, but he wrote in Psychology Today, sometime I think in the 70s, he said, you know, when we did away with sin, we lost our definition of ourselves. It's a skeptic saying that. We lost who we were. Description of the human condition. Secondly, in the person of Christ as he is revealing God, the marvelous coalescing of absolutes in him. Time's running out, so let me race here. 2 years ago, actually a year and a half ago, I was asked to speak at the United Nations prayer breakfast. It was the second time they'd asked me to come, only this time I marveled at the subject, navigating with absolutes in a relativistic world. You get up at 6:30 in the morning to speak on that. And then you're told you have 25 minutes. And then you're further told you cannot bring religion into it. I said, I'll make a deal. 20 minutes, your subject, last 5 minutes, why I believe in what I do as being the only answer to this struggle. Okay, we agreed. So I talked about the search for 4 absolutes: evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. How do you define evil? How do you define justice? What is true love? And when you blow it, how are you forgiven? They all nodded their heads. I said, now I want to ask you with 5 minutes to go, do you know of one event in the world where these 4 converged? I said, they converged on the cross of Jesus Christ. Evil was seen for what it was. Justice was met out by a righteous and a holy God. Love was displayed unparalleled to a point where he looks at a young man and says, take care of her. She's now your mother. A cosmic drama was unfolding, and he cared for the one woman who had so nurtured and cared for him. And then I said, forgiveness, that he's willing to wipe your slate clean and forgive you. Do you know, there was an ambassador from one country, I will not name it, it was an atheistic country. They stood in line to shake hands. The president of the UN says, would you come up to my office and please pray for me and my staff? I go up and come. Before that, this man shakes his hand. He said, can I talk to you for a moment? He said, I come from an atheistic country. I didn't want to come here. I don't want to come here. We don't believe in God out there. And I wondered why I was here. He said, this morning I find out why I'm here. Pray for me. God revealed in Christ, where absolutes converge in an unparalleled way. The description of evil, the convergence of absolutes, thirdly, the disclosure of reality. You know why I think men and women like you come to a conference like this? was talking to my wife about it. She was not able to join me last evening. She became unwell just as we were leaving. And I wondered if it was because of my sermon, but it wasn't. It was okay. She's feeling much better today and joined me here. But I said to her, why do they come? You know why you all come? Because you want to go deep. You want to go deep. God is able to take a little child and place that child at the center and say, such is the kingdom of heaven. And he's able to look at a Nicodemus and say, you're a teacher and you don't understand these things? He's able to take the sublime and make it simple. He's able to take the simple and show you the sublimity behind it. The unfathomable depths of God's riches. You know what I think is going to be the biggest point of our delight in eternity? That we will be silent when we are face to face with the Trinity. Peter knew the difference between one fish and 3 fishes. Paul knew the difference between 1 and 3. This marvelous mystery of the Trinity, which may be the only explanation for the Greek search of unity and diversity. Because unity and diversity in the effect must presuppose unity and diversity in the first cause. And only in the Trinity is there the community of unity in diversity. God is a being in relationships, and our hearts hunger for a relationship as we live here. Marvelous depth of truth. The atheist stuff looks so shallow after this. You say, what? When somebody asked Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate, for originally cracking the code of the DNA, he said, how did we come to be then? What happened? How did we have all these components to bring us to being? This was a skeptic asking him. Do you know what Francis Crick said? It would have to have been a spaceship that came from another planet, that brought spores to seed the earth, and that's how we came to be. Now, if that's reason, give me faith. I don't have that kind of faith. That's what you call nonsense in sophisticated language. He says that again and again and again. No, when we see the disclosure of reality, and the last thing I say to you is this, the resurrection of the body. The resurrection of the body. Isn't it marvelous to know that God identifies both the physicality and the spirituality as real components of our lives? We will have a glorified body, and so if you violate sexuality, you violate it at your own risk. You violate the temple of the living God. The absolutes are shown in the sacredness of the body and the sacredness of that transcending spirit of the human being. God raises the body, as it were, the resurrected body. My wife's father passed away 1.5 years ago, and he was a military man. He was in the Second World War navigating. Whenever a body was ever lowered into the ground, he always stood at attention, saluted. The respect. The person may be dead and not inhabiting the body, but the body was a place of respect. You respect the human body. You remember that. And that's why Jesus wept even at the grave of his friend, knowing he was going to raise him again. And he said, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. I want to close with one humorous line, and I think I'm just on target here, I believe. That in itself is a Class B miracle. That alone ought to make you believe in God. When the great chess master, Garry Kasparov of Russia, was going to play a computer in a chess match, he beat the first one, and the boys got together and said, we'll design the best computer in the world, an IBM computer called Deep Blue. And we're going to build one that'll beat you, Kasparov. Kasparov got nervous and went away into hiding for many months because he was afraid that if he lost to Deep Blue, he would lose the dignity of humanity in the process. He doesn't know I lost that dignity after the calculators came out. He's worried about the computers taking it away from him. But here's what so David Galertner, professor of computer science from Yale University, writes this in response to Kasparov's fear that his loss to Deep Blue would end up in the loss of dignity for humanity. Listen to this brilliant professor of computer science, David Galertner. The idea that Deep Blue has a mind is absurd. How can an object that wants nothing, fears nothing, enjoys nothing, needs nothing, and cares nothing have a mind? Oh, it can win at chess, but not because it wants to. It isn't happy when it wins or sad when it loses. What are Deep Blue's after-the-match plans if it ends up beating Kasparov? Is it hoping to take Deep Pink out for a night in the town? No, it doesn't. It doesn't care about chess or anything else. It plays the game for the same reason a calculator adds or a toaster toasts, because it's a machine designed for that purpose. No matter what feats they perform inside, there will always be a big fat zero. No computer can achieve artificial thought without achieving artificial emotion too. In the long run, I doubt if there is any kind of human behavior computers cannot fake, any kind of performance they cannot put on. It is conceivable that one day computers will be better than humans at nearly everything. I can imagine that a person might even someday have a computer for a best friend. Oh, but that'll be sad. Like having a dog for your best friend, only sadder. By the way, I like dogs. We have one. But the gap between the human and surrogate is permanent and will never be closed. Listen now. Machines will continue to make life easier, healthier, richer, and more puzzling. And human beings will continue to care ultimately about the same things they always have, about one another, and many of them about God. He could not make that article stick without that last line. The difference between a machine and you is huge because of God. Do you know, Francis Thompson ran from God most of his life, and he would hang out at Charing Cross to get his drugs and sleep by the River Thames. And then God hounded him, followed him. You've read his story in The Hound of Heaven, but then he wrote this brilliant one. Hanging around at Charing Cross and by the River Thames, he wrote this: O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we know thee. Inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean? An eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not whether wheeling systems darken, or our benumbed conceiving soars, the drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your estranged faces that amiss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder, pitched between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. When Bertrand Russell was asked why he didn't believe in God, he said, because he didn't give me enough evidence. If you listen to Francis Thompson, he'd find out it's not the absence of evidence, it's the suppression of it. God will meet you where you are. When my father-in-law died, he was a gentleman to the end. He was a great man. But he started to tear his clothes off. He was losing it. Shrunken down to a bag of bones. Diagnosis to death, 4 months, 85 years old. Quintessential gentleman, man of God. He lost his voice, lost everything. My wife was standing by his bed along with her sisters and her mother. Finally, he got enough strength to reach out to his wife of 63 years. He had no voice. He said, I love you. He just mouthed it, I love you. He put his head back on the pillow looked to the heavens and said, amazing, just amazing. And he was gone. But purer and higher and greater will be our wonder, our transport when Jesus we see. Deny God, the philosophical entailments are insoluble. Find the steps to him, something beyond the physical, only an intelligent entity who came into history, who described and was seen and was heard, who described your heart and mine and the person of God. I believe in God, who sent his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, because of whom I stand before you, because of whom I was rescued from a bed of suicide at the age of 17 in Delhi. He was near to me. He's near to you. Love the atheist and live the life, as Ronald Reagan used to say in his own simple way. Serve the atheist with a fine dinner and ask him if he believes in a cook. God bless you. Thank you.